The first time I broke one of the rules, the ocean answered by changing something it should never have been able to touch. I remember staring at my own reflection in the sub's glass, realizing I was already too deep to undo what I'd done. There were 11 strange rules we were given before descending into the Mariana Trench, and every one of them was framed like a suggestion instead of a warning. I thought I understood pressure, darkness, isolation, and fear. I was wrong, because one rule wasn't about survival at all. And even now, I don't know if breaking it is what woke them up, or if they were always awake. The descent slowed so gradually that my body noticed it before my mind did, a subtle easing of pressure that made my ears stop aching all at once. Outside the viewport, the water looked thicker, darker, as if light itself had learned it was no longer welcome. I reminded myself of Rule 1, never name a new species while you are still below the thermocline, mostly because saying it in my head helped calm my nerves. We had crossed a boundary that wasn't marked on any map, and even after years as a marine biologist, I could feel that this depth didn't care about credentials. The sub's instruments glowed softly, the only proof that science still applied down here. Dr. Hanley floated beside me, strapped into his seat, his face lit pale blue by the data screen. He refused to stop checking. He smiled in that tired, confident way he always did, and said this depth was exactly where discovery lived, where names were born. I didn't answer him right away, because I was watching something drift past the glass, just at the edge of our lights. It moved slowly, deliberately, not like debris, and not like any organism I recognized from textbooks or dives. My chest tightened, not from fear exactly, but from the strange certainty that it knew we were watching it. The object, or creature, hovered close enough now that the cameras adjusted on their own, as if drawn to it. Its shape was wrong in a way that's hard to explain without sounding dramatic, asymmetrical but balanced, like it had been designed by a logic we don't use anymore. Hanley leaned forward, excitement cutting through his usual calm, and started describing it aloud for the recorder. I interrupted him, telling him to wait, to let me observe longer, because something about it felt unfinished, like we were seeing only part of it. He laughed quietly and reminded me that hesitation was how discoveries slip through history, unnamed and forgotten. I tried to explain that it wasn't about superstition or fear, that the briefing before the dive had been clear for a reason. Hanley rolled his eyes and said, "The people who wrote those rules never expected us to find something truly new." As he spoke, the creature shifted, rotating slightly, and I noticed patterns along its surface that pulsed faintly, almost like a slow breath. The sub's lights flickered for just a moment, long enough to make my stomach drop, then stabilized again. I checked the power readings, but everything looked normal, too normal for how wrong that brief flicker felt. The creature drifted closer, close enough that I could see depth in it, layers folding into each other in ways that hurt to follow. I told Hanley we should back up, put some distance between us and it, but he was already recording notes faster, his voice tight with excitement. He said, half joking, that he was already thinking of a provisional name, something Latin and elegant, that would look good in a journal headline. My skin prickled when he said that, and I snapped at him to stop, my voice sharper than I intended. The tension in the sub thickened instantly, the kind that comes when fear and pride collide in a sealed metal space. Hanley stared at me, surprised, then annoyed, like I had just insulted his life's work. Before either of us could say more, the creature reacted, though reacted isn't quite the right word. The water around it distorted, bending our lights into long warped streaks, and the cameras struggled to focus. The instruments started feeding conflicting data, depths shifting by meters even though we hadn't moved. My heart hammered as I realized the sub wasn't drifting, the environment itself was changing around us. Hanley went quiet, his mouth half open as if a word had gotten stuck there. I watched the creature's patterns brighten slightly, responding to something unseen, something internal. It felt suddenly important that no sound escaped Hanley's lips, as if speech itself had weight down here. I placed a hand on his arm, not looking at him, and shook my head slowly, begging him without words to stop. The silence stretched, heavy and uncomfortable, broken only by the hum of the sub and the low groan of pressure against its hull. The creature lingered, suspended in front of us, then began to withdraw, sinking back into the darkness it came from. As it faded from view, the distorted light snapped back to normal, and the instruments settled like nothing strange had happened. I realized I was holding my breath and forced myself to exhale. Hanley finally spoke, his voice quieter now, stripped of its earlier excitement, and admitted that for a moment, he felt like the creature was waiting for something from him. I didn't ask what he meant, because I already knew, and because saying it out loud felt dangerous. I logged the encounter carefully, sticking to measurements and neutral descriptions, avoiding anything that felt like ownership. My hands trembled as I typed, not from cold, but from the lingering sense that we had almost crossed a line we couldn't uncross. As we resumed our planned route, the darkness outside seemed closer than before, pressing in on the sub from all sides. I kept thinking about how easily curiosity turns into entitlement, especially when there's no one around to say no. Down here, consequences didn't announce themselves with alarms or warnings. They waited. And as the sub moved deeper into the trench, I couldn't shake the feeling that something had noticed our restraint, and that it was disappointed we hadn't gone further. The lights ahead revealed a jagged formation rising from the seafloor, unnatural in its angles, like a scar in the earth. Hanley stared at it in silence, and I felt a new tension settle between us, unspoken but heavy. Whatever we were about to find next, I knew it would test more than our training. And as the sub angled toward that formation, I wondered how long restraint would last before someone decided the rules no longer applied. The sub drifted closer to the jagged formation, and for the first time since the descent began, the pilot hesitated instead of adjusting course immediately. The shape ahead of us rose from the seafloor at sharp, deliberate angles, nothing like coral or rock I had studied before, and my chest tightened as I remembered Rule 2. Do not illuminate structures that appear artificial while staring straight at it. Our forward lights were still on their lowest setting, barely brushing the edges of the structure like a nervous glance. I could tell from the pilot's breathing that he wanted to increase the lights, to understand what we were seeing. None of us said anything, because the silence itself felt like a warning. From this distance, the structure looked unfinished, like something abandoned halfway through construction. Its surfaces uneven but intentional. Shadows clung to it in places where light should have reached, creating pockets of darkness that felt deeper than the surrounding water. Dr. Hanley leaned forward again, his earlier confidence muted but not gone, and asked quietly if we could get a clearer look. I told him no, my voice steady even though my hands were not, and pointed out that we didn't need more light to record its presence. The pilot nodded, but his eyes flicked repeatedly toward the light controls. As we circled slowly, the structure revealed more of itself, extending farther than I had expected, its base disappearing into sediment that looked disturbed, as if it had risen recently. The sub's external cameras adjusted automatically, trying to compensate for the low visibility, and the resulting images made my stomach turn. The angles didn't line up the way geometry should, creating the illusion that parts of it were shifting when I knew they weren't. I told myself it was just my brain struggling with scale and depth, but the unease wouldn't fade. Hanley broke the silence by saying it reminded him of ruins, and I snapped my head toward him, sharper than necessary. He raised his hand slightly, apologetic, but his eyes were alight with the same curiosity that had nearly undone us before. I reminded him that words mattered down here, that framing things as human made it easier to forget where we were. The pilot cleared his throat and announced that we were holding position, letting the sub stabilizers do their work. Even that small mechanical sound felt intrusive in the vast quiet. Time stretched as we observed without intervening, and I became acutely aware of how exposed we were, a single bright speck in an endless dark. The structure didn't change, didn't move, yet the longer we stayed, the more it felt like it was asserting itself into our awareness. My eyes kept drifting to the shadows along its surface, imagining depth where the cameras showed none. I caught myself wondering what stronger light would reveal, and the thought scared me more than the structure itself. The pilot muttered that the sensors were picking up irregular reflections, like the surface wasn't uniform. I asked him to repeat it, and he did, adding that it was interfering with range finding. That shouldn't have been possible, not from a stationary object, and I felt a cold pressure settle behind my eyes. Hanley suggested that increased illumination could solve the issue, said it was probably just a trick of the angles. I shook my head, reminding both of them that interference was often the point, not a problem to fix. As if responding to the conversation, the sub drifted a few meters closer, nudged by a current I couldn't feel through the hull. The structure loomed larger now, its surfaces filling more of the viewport, and the sense of scale became overwhelming. I noticed markings then, faint but repetitive, etched or grown into the surface in patterns that made my vision blur if I focused too long. I forced myself to look away, grounding myself in the familiar glow of the control panels. Hanley leaned closer to the glass, his breath fogging it slightly, and whispered that the patterns looked organized. I told him to sit back, my voice low but firm, and he obeyed after a moment's hesitation. The pilot's hand hovered near the light controls again, and I could tell he was fighting instinct. Humans are wired to illuminate the unknown, to banish fear with brightness, and that instinct felt especially dangerous here. I reminded myself that darkness can be protective, a boundary rather than a threat. The cameras flickered briefly, not failing but shifting perspective, as if trying to frame the structure differently. For a split second, the image looked closer than it should have been, filling the screen with dark surfaces and shallow angles. My heart lurched, and I gripped the edge of my seat, waiting for the view to snap back. When it did, everything appeared unchanged, but the feeling that something had leaned in to look at us lingered. The pilot swore under his breath and reported a slight pressure change, minor but unexpected at this stable depth. I asked him to pull us back a few meters, just enough to re-establish distance. The thrusters engaged softly, and the sub eased backward, the structure shrinking reluctantly in the viewport. Relief washed through me, brief and incomplete, like surfacing after holding your breath too long. I realized how tense my shoulders were only when they started to ache. Hanley sat back, rubbing his temples, and admitted that being this close made him feel like he was intruding. That word stuck with me, echoing in my mind as I watched the structure recede. Intrusion implied ownership, boundaries we didn't understand, and had no right to cross. I logged the structure as an anomaly, careful to keep my language neutral and observational. Even typing felt like a risk, as if description itself could be a form of illumination. As we prepared to move on, the pilot hesitated again, glancing between the dark structure and the open water beyond it. He asked if we were sure about leaving without proper visuals. His tone conflicted. I told him yes, more forcefully than before, and he nodded, trusting me despite the questions in his eyes. The sub turned slowly, our light sweeping away from the structure and back into open darkness. I felt an immediate, unsettling sense of relief, like something had relaxed its attention. The structure faded from view, swallowed by darkness, as if it had never been there at all. The instruments stabilized fully, and the pressure readings returned to expected values, reinforcing the illusion that nothing had happened. Yet I couldn't shake the image of those angles, those markings that refused to resolve in my mind. As we descended deeper into the trench, I realized that avoiding illumination hadn't erased the structure from existence. It had only postponed our understanding of it, and I feared that postponement had a cost we hadn't yet paid. Ahead of us, the seafloor dropped away sharply, revealing a deeper void within the trench itself, darker than anything we'd passed so far. The pilot adjusted course, and the sub angled downward once more, committing us to the next phase of the dive. I watched the darkness ahead, feeling the weight of unseen rules stacking up around us. Whatever waited below, I sensed it would not remain content with observation for long. The sub angled downward into the deeper void, and the darkness ahead felt heavier, almost layered, as if we were descending through stacked shadows instead of water. I checked the sonar display out of habit, watching the clean arcs sweep outward and return empty. And I remembered Rule 3. If you see movement where the sonar shows nothing, do not ask for a second scan, as a flicker passed the viewport. It was brief, just a suggestion of motion beyond the reach of our lights, but it pulled my attention away from the instruments. My stomach tightened as I realized the sonar showed nothing at all in that direction. The pilot noticed my silence and asked what I was seeing, his voice low but steady, trained to pick up changes in tone. I hesitated, weighing honesty against instinct, and finally said I thought the water had shifted strangely. Hanley leaned over my shoulder, eyes darting between the sonar and the dark beyond the glass. He joked that deep water plays tricks on perception, but his laugh didn't last long. The sub continued its slow descent, the hum of systems feeling louder than it should have. Another movement caught my eye, longer this time, like a shadow sliding just outside the cone of light. I felt the urge to lean forward, to search for it, but forced myself to stay still. The sonar remained blank, an empty promise of safety that didn't match what my eyes were telling me. I focused on my breathing, counting it out, trying to ground myself in training instead of fear. The memory of the briefing surfaced again, heavy with implications I hadn't taken seriously enough before. Hanley broke the silence by suggesting we run another active scan, just to be sure our readings were accurate. The words made my chest tighten, and I shook my head immediately, perhaps too quickly. He frowned, clearly confused, and asked why I was so certain we didn't need confirmation. I told him the equipment was functioning fine, that repeated scans would only waste power. It wasn't a lie, but it wasn't the whole truth either. The pilot glanced at me, then back to the controls, trusting my judgment in a way that felt undeserved. He adjusted our descent rate slightly, slowing us down as if caution could be measured in meters per minute. Outside, the darkness seemed to respond, the sense of movement growing closer to the edges of the viewport. I kept my eyes fixed on the sonar, willing it to stay empty. The idea of seeing something appear there felt worse than seeing nothing at all. A faint distortion rippled through the water ahead, bending our lights into a subtle curve. Hanley inhaled sharply, his hand gripping the edge of his seat, and I knew he'd seen it too. He whispered that something was there, even if the instruments disagreed, and asked again about running a scan. I met his gaze and told him no, my voice firmer this time, and the finality in it seemed to settle him. The pilot didn't ask questions, which somehow made the moment heavier. The distortion passed, slipping away into the dark like it had never existed. The light straightened, the water returned to its uniform black, and the sonar stayed stubbornly empty. Relief washed over me, but it was thin, stretched tight over a growing unease. I wondered if the emptiness on the screen was absence or refusal. Down here it was hard to tell the difference. Hanley rubbed his face, trying to laugh it off, and said maybe we were all just on edge after the structure above. I nodded, even though I didn't believe that was the whole story. The sense of being observed lingered, not focused but diffuse, like pressure applied evenly from all sides. I logged the anomaly as visual distortion without corresponding sonar contact. Writing it down felt like acknowledging a debt I didn't know how to pay. As we continued downward, the trench seemed to open around us, the walls falling away into an even deeper basin. The pilot announced our depth in a steady voice, each number marking a new personal record for the team. I should have felt exhilaration, pride even, but instead I felt smaller with every meter. The darkness ahead wasn't just empty, it felt expectant. I kept my hands folded tightly in my lap to stop them from shaking. Another movement slid past, slower this time, deliberate enough that I could follow its path. It stayed just beyond the lights, tracing the boundary like it understood exactly where we could see. Hanley sucked in a breath and started to speak, then stopped himself, glancing at me first. I shook my head slightly, and he closed his mouth, swallowing whatever question had formed there. The unspoken agreement between us felt fragile, held together by fear rather than trust. The pilot reported a minor fluctuation in external pressure, Nothing alarming, but enough to note. I told him to maintain course and speed, resisting the urge to change anything. Part of me wanted to turn back, to retreat to known depths where rules felt less abstract, but another part understood that retreat wouldn't erase what we'd already encountered. The trench had a way of making distance meaningless. The movement returned, closer now, and this time I saw texture in it, a suggestion of form that made my eyes ache. I forced myself not to track it directly, keeping my gaze soft and unfocused. The sonar still showed nothing, a blank circle that felt increasingly hostile in its calm. I realized that asking the instruments to confirm what we saw might be an invitation rather than a safeguard. The thought made my throat dry. Hanley leaned toward me and whispered that he felt like something was pacing us. I didn't respond verbally, only nodded once, slow and deliberate. The pilot's jaw tightened, and he adjusted our heading by a fraction, just enough to test if the sensation would change. It didn't. Whatever was out there matched us effortlessly, maintaining that same unsettling distance. I wondered how long it had been aware of us. The lights flickered again, not enough to trigger alarms, but enough to make the shadows jump. In that brief shift, I thought I saw the movement resolve into something closer to a silhouette. My heart hammered, and I bit down hard on the inside of my cheek to keep from reacting. The moment passed, leaving only darkness and the hum of the sub. I felt like I'd narrowly avoided acknowledging something that wanted acknowledgement. Minutes stretched on, each one thick with tension. As we descended deeper still, the movement gradually faded, slipping away as silently as it had arrived. None of us spoke for a long time, unwilling to break the fragile calm that followed. I stared at the empty sonar, feeling no comfort in its certainty. Whatever had been out there hadn't needed to appear on our screens to make its presence felt. The pilot finally asked if we should log the incident formally, his tone careful. I said yes, but kept the description minimal, sticking to objective details and times. Hanley watched me write, his expression unreadable, and I sensed a shift in him, a crack in his confidence. We were all learning that knowledge here came with consequences. Some things were safer left unmeasured. As the sub reached the next planned depth, a new feature appeared ahead, faintly visible even at the edge of our lights. It looked like a narrow trench within the trench, a deep scar cutting across the seafloor. The pilot adjusted course toward it, and my pulse quickened with a mix of dread and curiosity. I had the unsettling feeling that whatever had followed us before was still nearby, simply choosing not to be seen. And as we drifted toward that darker cut in the earth, I wondered what would happen if the sonar finally decided to show us the truth. The sub eased toward the narrow cut in the seafloor, and the darkness inside it looked different from the surrounding depths, denser and strangely matte. As I watched the opening swallow more of our forward view, I remembered Rule 4, never enter a secondary trench without logging an exit time, and my hand hovered over the console. The pilot asked if I wanted him to mark our entry now, or wait until we were fully inside. I told him to log it immediately, my voice steadier than I felt. Something about that dark channel made the idea of forgetting time feel dangerous. The walls of the secondary trench rose around us as we descended, closing in just enough to make the sub feel larger and more fragile at the same time. The rock surfaces were smoother here, worn into long curves that suggested age far beyond human history. Hanley pressed his face close to the glass, silent for once, his excitement replaced by focus. I logged the entry time carefully, double-checking the numbers, as if accuracy could keep us anchored. The pilot confirmed the log aloud, sealing the moment. Inside the trench, the water seemed quieter, not in sound, but in movement, as if currents avoided this place. Our lights traced the walls, revealing subtle ridges that ran parallel for meters before vanishing into shadow. I noticed how easily perspective broke down, distances collapsing the longer I stared. Hanley murmured that it felt like being inside something rather than between rocks. I didn't respond, because the thought had already occurred to me. The descent slowed further, and the pilot adjusted thrusters to keep us centered. I watched the depth indicator climb, each number feeling heavier than the last. My earlier sense of being followed returned, sharper now, as if the walls themselves were aware of us. I resisted the urge to look back at the sonar, knowing it wouldn't offer comfort. Trusting emptiness had already proven unreliable. Hanley asked what the rule briefing had said about secondary trenches, his tone casual but his eyes searching my face. I told him they were poorly understood, prone to optical illusions and equipment drift. That answer was technically true, but it skipped the part about disorientation and lost time. The pilot listened without comment, focusing on keeping us steady. I could tell he felt the same pressure I did, even if he couldn't name it. As we moved deeper, faint markings appeared along the trench walls, irregular at first, then increasingly patterned. They weren't carved so much as impressed, as if something had pressed itself repeatedly into the rock while it was still soft. My eyes traced the shapes automatically, trying to find meaning where none should exist. Hanley inhaled sharply and said they looked like measurements. I told him not to jump to conclusions, though the idea unsettled me. The instruments began to show minor discrepancies, small shifts in depth and orientation that corrected themselves too quickly to alarm. I noted them anyway, fingers tight on the controls as I typed. The pilot reported that the trench was curving ahead, bending just enough to hide what lay beyond. I felt a flicker of relief at the thought of walls, foolish as it was. Open darkness had started to feel more threatening than confinement. We rounded the curve slowly, and the trench widened into a chamber that made my breath catch. The walls pulled back abruptly, revealing a vast hollow space that swallowed our lights without reflection. It felt less like a cave and more like an absence, a place where the seafloor had been removed. Hanley whispered that the scale didn't make sense. I nodded, unable to find words that fit. The pilot held us at the edge of the chamber, thrusters barely engaged. I checked the log again, reassured by the timestamp that proved we had entered, and could, in theory, leave. My thoughts kept snagging on the idea of exit, on the need for an end to this space. The chamber's darkness pressed back against our lights, refusing to give shape or depth. I had the irrational fear that moving forward would erase the trench behind us. Hanley broke the silence by asking how long we should stay. I glanced at the clock, surprised by how little time seemed to have passed. It felt longer, stretched thin by tension and unfamiliar geometry. I told him we'd observe briefly, then retreat, my words chosen carefully. The pilot acknowledged, but his posture remained rigid, ready for sudden movement. As if in response to our presence, something shifted within the chamber, a subtle change in the way darkness layered itself. I leaned forward, squinting, trying to distinguish motion from illusion. The walls behind us seemed farther away than before, the trench mouth narrower, more distant. I told myself it was perspective, a trick of the lights and shadows. The certainty didn't hold. The pilot reported a slight delay in thruster response, fractions of a second that shouldn't exist. My heart thudded as I checked the systems, finding no obvious fault. Hanley's voice tightened as he asked if we were drifting. I told him no, though the view suggested otherwise. The chamber felt less like a place, and more like a condition we were slipping into. I forced myself to focus on procedure, on the comfort of steps and logs. I checked the entry time again, grounding myself in numbers. The idea of exit felt suddenly abstract, like something theoretical rather than physical. Hanley noticed my repeated glances and asked if something was wrong. I shook my head, unwilling to voice a fear I couldn't define. The darkness ahead seemed to deepen, forming a vague gradient that drew the eye inward. I felt an urge to move forward, to resolve the uncertainty by confronting it directly. That impulse scared me more than the chamber itself. I tightened my grip on the console, anchoring myself in the present. Curiosity had already nearly cost us once. The pilot announced that he was initiating a slow reverse, just to test our mobility. The thrusters engaged, and for a moment nothing happened. My pulse spiked, every muscle tensing as I waited. Then gradually, the view shifted, the trench mouth inching closer. Relief washed over me, tempered by the knowledge that it hadn't been immediate. Hanley exhaled and tried to laugh, but the sound came out strained. He said the place felt reluctant to let us go, half joking, half not. I didn't respond, watching the walls carefully for any change. The markings seemed closer now, more numerous, though I couldn't swear they hadn't always been that way. Doubt crept into every observation. As we backed toward the trench proper, I noticed the chamber's darkness thinning, giving way reluctantly to the familiar curves of rock. The instruments stabilized, their readings snapping back into expected ranges. I logged the anomalies with clinical language, avoiding any hint of interpretation. Writing felt like closing a door. When we finally cleared the chamber and re-entered the narrower trench, I felt a sharp, almost painful sense of relief. The walls pressed in again, solid and comprehensible compared to the void we'd left behind. The pilot stopped the reverse and held position, giving us all a moment to breathe. Hanley wiped his face, his confidence visibly shaken. I checked the time once more and realized, with a chill, that more minutes had passed than I remembered. Not enough to panic, but enough to raise questions I didn't want answered yet. I logged our exit from the chamber carefully, marking it as an internal feature rather than a separate location. Precision felt important, even if it was an illusion. As we prepared to continue along the trench, I couldn't shake the feeling that the space we'd entered hadn't been empty. It felt used, like a corridor rather than a destination. The thought that others might exist deeper within it made my stomach knot. Ahead of us, the trench narrowed again, descending into even darker water. The pilot asked for confirmation to proceed, his voice steady but edged with caution. I looked at the dark path ahead, then at the logs anchoring us to time and place. I gave the go-ahead, aware that each decision was layering risk onto risk. As the sub moved forward once more, I wondered what would happen if at some point, time stopped agreeing with us at all. The trench narrowed further as we moved forward, and the walls felt close enough that I imagined reaching out and touching them through the hull. I prepared the sampling equipment out of routine, even as a knot tightened in my stomach, and I remembered Rule 5, do not acknowledge biological samples that appear to react while calibrating the intake arm. The pilot slowed us to a crawl, careful not to stir sediment that could cloud our view. Hanley watched the monitors closely, his earlier confidence replaced by a cautious intensity. Everything about this space felt like it was waiting for us to do something specific. The sampling arm extended smoothly, its metal joints moving with quiet precision as it reached toward a cluster of pale growths clinging to the trench wall. They looked organic at first glance, soft and irregular, like colonies shaped by pressure and time. I focused on the data feed, watching chemical readings scroll past in familiar patterns. Hanley leaned closer, murmuring that the structures didn't match any known classification. I told him we'd analyze later, keeping my tone deliberately flat. As the intake drew closer, one of the growths shifted, just slightly, a change so subtle it could have been dismissed as current movement. My breath caught before I could stop it, and I forced myself to stay still. The instruments didn't register motion, and the camera feed showed nothing definitive. Hanley frowned, replaying the last few seconds of footage, and said it looked like the sample had contracted. I reminded him that pressure differentials could cause visual distortion. The arm made contact, enclosing part of the growth in a sealed container. The moment the seal engaged, the reading spiked briefly, then settled into an unfamiliar but stable range. I logged the data carefully, refusing to comment on the anomaly. Hanley opened his mouth to say something, then stopped, glancing at me as if reconsidering his words. The pilot kept his eyes forward, pretending not to notice the tension filling the sub. Inside the container, the sample appeared inert, its surface dull and unmoving. I felt a fragile sense of relief, like we'd passed a test without realizing it was there. The trench walls slid by slowly as we resumed forward motion, the sampling arm retracting with practiced ease. Hanley finally spoke, saying it was probably nothing, just deep-sea life adapting in ways we didn't understand yet. I nodded, even though the explanation felt thin. Minutes passed in relative calm, the earlier unease settling into a watchful quiet. I began to review the collected data, comparing it to baseline readings stored in the system. Something about the numbers bothered me, a pattern that almost formed before slipping away when I focused on it. I told myself it was fatigue, the cumulative stress of the dive wearing on my perception. Down here, doubt felt contagious. The container's internal camera feed flickered briefly, a momentary glitch that made the image blur. I froze, then forced myself to keep typing, pretending I hadn't seen it. Hanley noticed the flicker too, his fingers hovering over the controls to adjust the feed. I shook my head slightly, and he withdrew his hand, confusion flickering across his face. The pilot cleared his throat, the sound unnaturally loud in the confined space. The growth inside the container shifted again, unmistakable this time, its surface rippling as if something beneath it had flexed. My heart hammered, but I kept my expression neutral, eyes locked on my console. Hanley whispered my name, urgency creeping into his voice, and asked if that was normal. I replied evenly that pressure changes could cause delayed reactions, even though I knew we hadn't altered depth. Saying it out loud felt like reinforcing a fragile barrier. The pilot asked if we should isolate the container, his tone professional but tight. I told him no, that the readings were stable and isolation would disrupt the data. Part of me feared that any acknowledgement, even procedural, might matter more than we understood. The sample continued to move in small, deliberate ways, like it was testing the limits of its enclosure. I focused on my breathing, keeping it slow and controlled. Hanley leaned back, rubbing his face, clearly struggling with the urge to intervene. He muttered that it felt like the sample was aware of us, and I cut him off gently, reminding him to stick to observable facts. He nodded, swallowing his words, but his eyes stayed fixed on the container. The trench around us seemed to darken, the walls absorbing more of our light than before. I wondered if that was just my imagination, stretched thin by fear. Another flicker ran through the feed, longer this time, and the sample's surface briefly reflected our lights in a way that looked almost intentional. My pulse spiked, and I forced my hands to remain steady on the console. I logged the time and the readings, careful not to add commentary. Hanley's breathing quickened, and I could feel his attention pressing against me, waiting for direction. The weight of responsibility felt heavier than the pressure outside the hull. The pilot announced that we were approaching a wider section of the trench, his voice cutting through the tension. I acknowledged him, grateful for the distraction, and instructed him to maintain speed. The sample's movement slowed, then stopped, settling into stillness that felt anything but reassuring. I resisted the urge to stare at it, focusing instead on the navigation display. Silence stretched, thick and uncomfortable. Hanley finally spoke again, saying he didn't like leaving questions unanswered. I told him some answers came with costs we weren't prepared to pay. He looked at me for a long moment, then nodded slowly, understanding more than he wanted to. The pilot shifted in his seat, his posture rigid, like he was bracing for something unseen. The sub continued forward, a small fragile thing in an immense dark. As the trench widened, new formations came into view, their shapes unfamiliar but less oppressive than the narrow corridor behind us. I felt a slight easing of tension, though it didn't reach my core. The container remained quiet, its contents still and unreadable. I logged our position and status, maintaining the illusion of control. Routine had become a shield. Then, without warning, the container's readings dropped to 0, every sensor flatlining at once. No alarms sounded, no lights flashed, just a sudden absolute absence of data. Hanley inhaled sharply, and the pilot looked back at me, waiting for instruction. I stared at the screen, my mind racing, aware that whatever had been reacting had chosen to stop. And as the sub drifted into the wider darkness ahead, I realized that silence, down here, could be the most active response of all. The flatlined screen held my attention, as if it were pulling me into it, every value frozen at 0 in a way that felt deliberate rather than broken. I felt the urge rise in my chest, the trained instinct to fix, reset, restore, and I remembered Rule 6. If all readings drop to 0, do not attempt a system reset. While my fingers hovered just above the console, the pilot was already leaning forward, eyes locked on the diagnostics, waiting for my command. Hanley whispered that it had to be a glitch, that systems didn't fail so cleanly by accident. I lowered my hands slowly, forcing myself to stay still. The sub continued drifting forward at a steady pace, its internal systems humming as if nothing was wrong at all. Life support readings remained normal, propulsion steady, navigation intact, yet the sample container and several external sensors showed absolute nothing. Hanley argued that a controlled reset could isolate the issue before it spread, his voice tight with urgency. I told him to wait, keeping my tone calm even as my pulse thudded in my ears. Something about the zeros felt like a boundary rather than a malfunction. The pilot asked if he should hold position, his hand already resting near the thrusters. I nodded, and the sub slowed until we were nearly motionless in the water. Outside, the wider section of the trench loomed around us, its walls farther apart, but no less oppressive. The darkness felt smoother here, less broken by texture, like an unmarked surface. I watched the blank readings, trying to understand what kind of failure left everything else untouched. Hanley leaned closer to the diagnostics, pointing out that the timestamps were still advancing normally. He said that meant the system was alive, just not reporting. I agreed quietly, my mind racing through possibilities I didn't want to accept. Reporting required an observer, a relationship between sensor and subject. The idea that something had severed that relationship made my stomach twist. I told myself not to jump to conclusions, even as my thoughts betrayed me. Minutes passed with no change, the zeros holding steady like a held breath. The pilot shifted in his seat, tension visible in his shoulders, and asked again about the reset. I shook my head, reminding him we weren't losing control, just information. That distinction felt thin, but it was all I had. Hanley muttered that information was control, then went quiet when I didn't respond. I began cross-checking unaffected systems, looking for any subtle drift or inconsistency. Everything behaved perfectly, too perfectly, as if the sub were demonstrating its reliability. The contrast made the missing data feel louder, more intentional. Outside the viewport, the darkness seemed unchanged, yet I couldn't shake the sense that it was closer than before. I resisted the urge to lean forward, to search for movement where none should be. Hanley finally asked what the briefing had said about total sensor silence. I chose my words carefully, telling him it was rare and poorly understood. I didn't mention that the examples we'd been given all ended abruptly, logs stopping without explanation. The pilot listened, his jaw tightening as he processed the implication. None of us liked the idea that the rules existed because someone else had already failed to follow them. A faint tremor passed through the sub, so slight it barely registered, more a feeling than a measurable event. The pilot checked the hull integrity out of habit, and reported no anomalies. I nodded, though my skin prickled as if brushed by cold air. The zeros didn't change, remaining absolute and indifferent. It felt less like blindness, and more like being ignored. Hanley suggested we isolate the affected sensors, cutting them off from the rest of the system. I considered it, then rejected the idea, afraid that any attempt to interfere would count as acknowledgement. My answer frustrated him, and I saw the skepticism return to his eyes. He said quietly that doing nothing felt like the wrong choice. I didn't argue, because part of me agreed. Time stretched, elastic and uncomfortable, as we hovered in place. I became acutely aware of every small movement inside the sub, every shift of weight and breath. Outside, the trench walls seemed to blur at the edges, as if the darkness were thickening. I focused on the pilot's steady breathing, using it to anchor myself. Routine, I reminded myself, was how we survived. Without warning, one of the zeroed screens flickered, not returning data, but showing a brief distortion. It looked like a shadow passing over a lens, though the camera feed itself remained blank. Hanley inhaled sharply, his body tensing as if ready to act. I raised a hand, stopping him before he could reach the controls. The moment passed, leaving the zeros unchanged. The pilot asked if we should retreat to a previous depth, his voice carefully neutral. I considered it, weighing the risk of movement against the risk of staying still. Retreat felt like admission, like turning our backs on something that wanted attention. I told him to hold position a little longer, my words tasting like doubt. None of us liked the choice, but no alternative felt safer. The blank readings began to feel heavy, like a presence pressing against the inside of my skull. I caught myself imagining them, as eyes closed on purpose. Hanley rubbed his arms, saying it felt colder, though the temperature controls hadn't changed. I checked them anyway, reassured by their steady numbers. The idea that perception could shift without physical cause unsettled me more than any alarm. Another faint tremor ran through the sub, longer this time, followed by a subtle change in the way light reflected off the trench walls. The pilot reported a minor orientation adjustment, though he swore he hadn't touched the controls. I logged it automatically, my fingers moving on their own. The zeros remained silent witnesses to whatever was happening outside our instrument's reach. Hanley's patience finally cracked, and he said we couldn't just wait forever. I looked at him, seeing fear beneath the frustration, and told him waiting was sometimes the only thing that worked. He opened his mouth to argue, then closed it, nodding reluctantly. The pilot exhaled slowly, as if releasing tension he'd been holding for too long. The sub felt suddenly very small. Just as I began to consider our next move, the zeros vanished, replaced not by normal readings, but by delayed data flooding back all at once. Values jumped and corrected themselves in rapid succession, overwhelming the displays. Hanley swore softly, scanning the numbers, trying to make sense of the surge. The pilot steadied the sub as the systems recalibrated on their own. I felt a wave of cold relief mixed with dread. The readings stabilized, but they were wrong, subtly shifted in ways I couldn't immediately explain. Depth, pressure, orientation all agreed with each other, but not with my instincts. I logged the recovery carefully, noting the duration of the silence without interpretation. Hanley asked what it meant, his voice barely above a whisper. I told him I didn't know, and that honesty felt heavier than any answer. As we resumed slow forward movement, the darkness ahead seemed altered, less empty than before. I had the unsettling sense that something had finished listening. Whatever had taken our readings away had given them back on its own terms. And as the sub drifted deeper into the trench, I wondered what it expected us to do next now that it knew we could wait. The trench widened again, and the darkness seemed to shimmer faintly, almost as if the water itself were alive. Then, from the corner of my vision, I saw a glow, soft, rhythmic, and impossibly deliberate. I reminded myself of Rule 7, never approach a bioluminescent creature that watches you directly, and I forced my gaze away, keeping my eyes on the instrumentation rather than the hypnotic light. The pilot slowed the sub instinctively, as if he too felt the pull of something unseen. Hanley's fingers hovered over the observation screens, his excitement tempered by a sharp edge of unease I recognized all too well. The glow pulsed again, closer this time, revealing an outline so alien it made my stomach tighten. Its body moved with a grace that defied our understanding of fluid dynamics. Yet its gaze, or what I interpreted as a gaze, felt fixed on me. I told Hanley not to adjust the lights, and he swallowed a comment about wanting a better view. The pilot shifted slightly, keeping us at a safe distance, though the concept of safe had begun to feel abstract down here. Every pulse of light seemed purposeful, deliberate, and aware. I attempted to log the sighting, careful to describe only observable traits, but my fingers hesitated over the keyboard. Each pulse of its light seemed to echo inside my head, almost communicative, almost human in timing. Hanley whispered, "It's looking at us, isn't it?" I didn't answer. Speaking felt dangerous, as if acknowledgement alone might provoke it. The sub floated in the silent dark, a fragile bubble in an ocean that had started feeling alive. The creature moved closer, its glow intensifying in a pattern that suggested recognition, not randomness. I felt my pulse accelerate, though I knew outward signs were unnecessary for it to notice. Hanley leaned back, shaking his head slightly, muttering that we should retreat before it decided we were worth more than observation. I agreed internally, though every instinct screamed not to look directly at it. The pilot adjusted our course subtly, sliding us sideways to maintain a margin of water between us and the watching light. Another pulse, brighter and slower this time, traced an arc across the viewport, almost like it was testing our reactions. I felt the urge to respond, to illuminate part of the trench to see it better, but I clenched my hands in my lap and resisted. Hanley watched my restraint, eyes wide, lips parted, as if he wanted to comment. The pilot's movements were minimal, almost ceremonial, as if following an unspoken code. The creature's pulses started forming patterns, long arcs followed by short flashes, and I realized with a chill that it might be communicating, or at least experimenting. Every time I blinked, it adjusted, almost as if timing my reactions mattered. I forced myself to look at the instruments instead, grounding myself in numbers and not perception. Each log entry felt like a lifeline, a tether between rationality and instinct. Hanley finally asked what would happen if it followed us, his voice quiet, almost reverent. I told him that we weren't certain it would, but we couldn't risk any interaction. He nodded, swallowing the words he had begun to form. Outside, the creature maintained distance, but continued to track us, pulses radiating across the water. I felt a chill that wasn't from cold. It was the awareness of being watched in a place that was already hostile. The glow dimmed slightly as it drifted farther away, but the pulse lingered in my mind, a rhythm I couldn't ignore. I reminded myself silently why the rule existed. Acknowledgement invites attention, and attention here carries consequences. The pilot whispered a cautionary note about maintaining distance, which I confirmed with a slight nod. Hanley exhaled slowly, still captivated despite himself. Minutes passed as the creature receded, each pulse fading into darkness. The sub moved forward cautiously, leaving the creature behind but not its impression. The instruments reported normal readings, the light steady, but a subtle tension remained. It wasn't gone, and I knew instinctively that we hadn't seen the last of it. I logged the encounter, careful to use only factual observations. My fingers trembled slightly, despite my efforts to control them. Hanley avoided looking back at the viewport, though I knew he was tempted. The pilot adjusted our heading, preparing for the next segment of the trench. I realized that restraint had been survival, and that breaking it, even slightly, might have drawn more than just our attention. As the sub drifted deeper into the darkness, I couldn't shake the sense that the glowing creature had imprinted itself on the environment, and perhaps on us. Its pulse, precise and deliberate, lingered in my thoughts. I felt certain it had noted our restraint, or lack thereof, and that this observation was not without consequence. Ahead, the trench opened further, the unknown pressing us onward, and I knew the next challenge would test our discipline in ways that were far less forgiving. The trench opened into a wider basin, the walls now distant enough to make the sub feel exposed, a small bubble of metal in an immense black void. I saw the reflection first, subtle and wrong, in the faint shimmer of bioluminescence lingering from the previous encounter. It wasn't our own reflection. It moved just slightly behind our actions, a second entity mimicking every motion we made. I immediately remembered Rule 8. Never engage with a creature that mirrors your movements. My stomach tightening as I realized how closely it tracked us. Hanley leaned forward, eyes wide, whispering, "It's copying us." I shook my head, warning him not to interact. The pilot hesitated, hands frozen over the thrusters, sensing something unseen pressing against our controls. I kept my hands steady on the console, resisting the urge to make abrupt movements, knowing the creature would mirror any mistakes. The mirrored motions were subtle, a delay so slight it almost fooled the mind into believing it was coincidence. Hanley's fingers twitched over the observation panel, and I told him slowly, "Don't, just don't." He nodded, shivering despite the warmth of the sub. As we moved forward, the mirrored entity followed, staying a few meters away but perfectly replicating each tilt, turn, and adjustment we made. Its form was indistinct, shifting and blurred, like a shadow that remembered human anatomy, but never quite adhered to it. The longer we stayed in sight, the more it seemed aware, almost sentient in its mimicry. I reminded myself that the rule existed because engagement meant recognition, and recognition down here was dangerous. Hanley whispered about trying to trick it, moving a single instrument arm to see what would happen. I grabbed his wrist before he could, whispering harshly that any interaction might provoke it. The pilot's hands hovered tensely, ready to counter any sudden movement, his eyes flicking between the displays and the distorted shadow outside. The mirrored creature adjusted instantly to our restraint, confirming with unnerving precision that it wasn't random. The sub drifted slowly along the trench floor, every action measured, every micro-movement calculated. Even the subtle vibrations of the engines were mirrored, a reflection in liquid form that unnerved me to the core. Hanley swallowed, finally quiet, staring at the viewport with wide eyes. I could feel his tension pressing into me, a shared understanding that one wrong gesture could escalate the situation. The basin seemed alive with anticipation. Minutes passed, the mirrored movements unwavering, as though the creature was learning, not merely copying. I kept repeating in my mind why Rule 8, never engage with a creature that mirrors your movements, existed, why our survival depended on ignoring it. Yet the more I tried to look away, the more it filled the periphery of my vision, perfectly aligned with our path. The sub's internal lights seemed to reflect more vividly in the water, enhancing the uncanny effect. Hanley finally whispered that it might follow us forever if we don't escape its notice. I nodded without looking, tightening my focus on the instruments. The pilot adjusted course slightly, not to chase or provoke, but to slowly distance ourselves from the basin's center. Every fraction of a meter counted, even the smallest movement had to be precise. My pulse raced as I realized how fragile our safety had become. The mirrored creature's form began to shimmer, almost fading into the dark background but still perfectly aligned with us. I felt a wave of vertigo, a sickening awareness that we were being studied rather than observed. The sub's thrusters made small corrections, and the creature matched them without error. I gripped the console, counting breaths, counting seconds, careful not to initiate any new movement. Hanley asked in a trembling voice if it would ever stop. I told him I didn't know, and that answering could be fatal. The silence inside the sub was thick, only broken by the low hum of machinery. The creature's mimicry continued, unwavering, patient and unsettlingly precise. I realized that ignoring it was our only hope, though the effort to resist interaction was exhausting. After what felt like hours, though it was likely minutes, the creature finally drifted to the edge of the basin, keeping a fixed distance as if testing our patience. The sub's instruments returned to normal ranges, but I couldn't shake the sense that the entity was still aware of us. Hanley let out a shaky breath, but I held mine, unwilling to acknowledge relief. The mirrored creature remained there, just beyond the reach of light, waiting and watching, a silent warning etched into the darkness. I logged the encounter with clinical precision, avoiding speculation, but my hands shook with the weight of restraint. The pilot adjusted our heading and continued slowly along the trench, eyes still on the perimeter of our viewport. The darkness ahead stretched endlessly, yet we moved forward cautiously, every decision deliberate. I couldn't ignore the sense that this mirrored presence had marked us, and that our survival depended on the discipline of inaction. As the sub continued deeper into the trench, the basin behind us receded, but the memory of its imitation clung to the edges of my mind. I realized that ignoring a creature here wasn't passive. It was an act of vigilance, a commitment to survival. Ahead, the trench twisted into darker, tighter channels, and I knew the next challenge would demand even more precise adherence to the rules. The mirrored form might not be visible, but I felt its awareness lingering, waiting for the slightest slip. The trench narrowed sharply, forcing the sub to angle downward, walls brushing close enough to make every movement feel claustrophobic. A faint echo bounced off the rock, irregular, almost like deliberate tapping, and I remembered Rule 9, never attempt communication with unknown entities, as my throat tightened. Hanley's eyes widened as he heard it too, whispering, "Do you think it's trying to signal us?" I shook my head slowly, warning him in the quietest voice possible. The pilot held position, hands resting tensely on the controls, the hum of the sub feeling louder than before. The echoes repeated, more rhythmic now, bouncing along the trench like they were responding to our presence. I resisted the impulse to replay the sound on the internal speakers or to emit any signal in return. The temptation to establish understanding was primal, almost irresistible, but the rule burned in my mind. Engagement could invite consequences beyond comprehension. Hanley's fingers twitched over the console, tempted to test a response, and I snapped a quiet, "Don't," my eyes locking with his. Each pulse of sound was precise, deliberate, and unnervingly intelligent. My heart raced as I realized that whatever made it could perceive subtle vibrations, could read intent and hesitation. The pilot shifted slightly, careful not to disturb the sub's position. Outside, darkness pressed against us, opaque and infinite, and every shadow seemed to quiver with potential awareness. I focused on the instruments, grounding myself in data that felt safe because it didn't respond. Hanley whispered that maybe it wanted something, a pattern to follow or recognition. I refused to answer, repeating silently why communication was forbidden. To engage was to invite presence into our space, to become participants rather than observers. I tightened my hands in my lap, willing the impulse to act away. The tapping echoed again, longer and slower, almost teasing, and I felt a tremor of fear coil through me. The pilot asked if we should move laterally to avoid the source. I nodded, careful to sound calm, but the sub's movement was subtle, calculated, maintaining distance while keeping us within the trench's curve. The echoes shifted, matching our subtle adjustments, as if the source was tracking us. I swallowed, aware that any sudden motion could provoke more than curiosity. Hanley looked pale, eyes darting between the monitors and the viewport. Minutes passed with the rhythmic tapping continuing, each beat precise, each pause measured. I felt the compulsion to respond, just to understand, but I fought it tooth and nail. Even silence became oppressive, each second stretching into an eternity of potential consequences. The pilot's breathing was the only audible sound, slow and deliberate, a contrast to the tense anticipation pressing in from the walls. I reminded myself that adhering to the rule was our only safeguard. Another pulse, longer and deeper, resonated through the hull. I felt it as a vibration, subtle but unmistakable, like the trench itself was speaking. Hanley flinched but stayed still, finally recognizing that movement or sound from us would be catastrophic. The pilot adjusted the sub's position incrementally, maintaining caution while keeping us aligned with the trench floor. I focused on logging everything without interpreting it, resisting the human need to assign meaning. The echoes began to taper off, fading gradually into the oppressive silence, but the memory of their rhythm lingered. I noticed a subtle shift in the darkness, shapes that hadn't been there before, blurred and formless. My pulse quickened, knowing that the absence of sound didn't mean the entity was gone. Hanley swallowed audibly, finally muttering that it had felt alive, sentient even. I gave no response, keeping the discipline of silence. The sub moved cautiously, rounding a sharp curve that obscured the echoes entirely. The instruments reported normal readings, yet the weight of unseen awareness pressed on us. I realized that the trench itself seemed altered, as though the rhythmic tapping had marked it somehow, an invisible mapping that only entities of this depth could perceive. Hanley glanced at me, clearly unsettled, and I simply nodded slightly. A warning in the rule had been proven true. Engagement would have invited more than observation. As we drifted deeper, the darkness ahead seemed to thicken, almost tactile, as if holding memory of the tapping. I felt a shiver run down my spine, not from cold, but from understanding that the rule existed because consequences weren't immediate, they were latent. The pilot asked if we should log the trench as hazardous, and I agreed, pressing the timestamp carefully into the system. Ahead, the channel narrowed again, forcing us toward the next test of restraint. I could still feel the echo in my mind, like a pulse synchronized with my own heartbeat. Every instinct screamed to respond, to ask, to communicate, but I remembered the rule, sharp and clear. Silence, observation, and discipline were all we had. The trench held its secrets closely, and I understood now that breaking this rule could have meant much more than danger. It could have meant exposure, and we weren't ready to pay that price. As the sub continued forward, the darkness enveloped us fully, and I felt the presence of the tapping linger, just beyond reach, an invisible spectator in the black. Hanley remained quiet, finally understanding the lesson of restraint. The pilot's hands rested lightly on the controls, tension palpable. I exhaled slowly, reminding myself that adherence to the rules was our only shield. Ahead, the trench twisted into unknown territory, and I braced for the next challenge, knowing it would demand vigilance, obedience, and nerves of steel. The trench twisted again, currents eddying in ways that made navigation tricky, and I noticed something odd, a dark shape moving upstream, defying the flow of water as if propelled by will rather than physics. Immediately, I recalled Rule 10, never investigate shadows that move against the current, my stomach tightening as the instinct to study it warred with the imperative to ignore. Hanley's eyes widened at the sight, whispering, "It's going the wrong way against the current." I shook my head slowly, signaling him to stay calm. The pilot's hands tensed on the controls, adjusting subtly to maintain our course without attracting attention. The shadow lingered at the edge of our lights, a vague form that shifted and stretched like smoke underwater. Every time I looked, it seemed closer, yet it never advanced in a straight line, instead curving around obstacles with impossible precision. Hanley leaned forward, voice low, asking if we should illuminate it more clearly. I refused, shaking my head, knowing that acknowledgement itself could be dangerous. The sub moved silently, a metal bubble carrying fragile humans through an indifferent abyss. I focused on instruments instead, pretending the shadow was merely a trick of light and water, though every instinct screamed otherwise. Its movements were deliberate, intelligent, and unnervingly persistent. The current carried debris and microbubbles, yet the shadow ignored them all, slipping around obstacles as if aware of the environment better than we were. Hanley's breathing grew shallow. I sensed him wrestling with the same urge to investigate that I had to suppress. The pilot whispered that we should increase speed, maintain distance, but not engage. I nodded, appreciating the restraint in his voice. Every small maneuver of the sub seemed to be mirrored, anticipated even, as though the shadow was learning our patterns. I realized that the rule existed, not just for safety, but because curiosity here was lethal, capable of drawing entities into focus we couldn't manage. Hanley's hands hovered uselessly, frozen in a mix of fear and fascination. The shadow moved closer, slipping between boulders, twisting and elongating unnaturally, yet never breaking the illusion of substance. I forced myself to look elsewhere, noting only the patterns in sonar readings and water pressure changes. The pilot maintained position, subtle corrections only, as the sub drifted downstream with the current, careful not to provoke the anomaly. I could feel tension coiling in my stomach like a living thing. Hanley whispered that it seemed to mimic our path, moving against the current just to intersect with us. I stayed silent, reminding him, reminding myself, why Rule 10? never investigate shadows that move against the current, existed. This wasn't a question of bravery or science, it was survival. Every instinct screamed to follow, to illuminate, to understand, yet restraint was the only thing standing between us and something we couldn't comprehend. Minutes passed in oppressive silence, the shadow twisting around corners and boulders, appearing and disappearing like a phantom. The sub's lights caught fleeting hints of its shape, elongated limbs, distorted angles, reflections that shouldn't exist underwater. Hanley murmured again, almost to himself, that it was intelligent. I refused to answer, keeping our communication minimal, every word or movement potentially dangerous. The pilot's hands remained light but alert on the controls. Another surge of current pushed us slightly off course, and the shadow adjusted immediately, curving back toward us, confirming that it was aware, observant, calculating. I felt a chill run down my spine as I realized our attempts at avoidance were noted and countered. We were being watched in a place where vision and instruments could fail, and ignoring it was not passive, it was active survival. Hanley swallowed, finally silent, his fascination held in check by fear. The shadow finally receded, sliding into a darker recess of the trench, yet the awareness of it lingered, like a weight pressing down on the sub. I noted the time, logging the encounter without commentary. The pilot kept us steady, moving slowly past the spot, eyes flicking to the instruments and the faint shadows beyond. I felt a quiet tension, knowing that even though it was gone, it hadn't stopped observing. As the sub drifted further, deeper into the trench, I realized that the rule had been clear for a reason. Acknowledging or pursuing such anomalies invites presence into our space, a presence that doesn't require explanation or logic to be lethal. Hanley remained rigid, finally understanding the importance of non-engagement. Ahead, the trench descended into near absolute darkness, and I braced for the final rule, aware that the margin for error had narrowed to almost nothing. The trench opened into an enormous basin, wider and darker than anything we'd encountered before, its walls fading into the inky black, as if swallowed by the ocean itself. I felt a weight in my chest, a premonition I couldn't ignore, and remembered Rule 11. Always leave the deepest chamber before sunset, as the dim glow of our sublights barely reached the distant floor. Hanley's eyes darted around, taking in the vast emptiness with awe and fear. "I don't even want to think about staying here too long," he whispered. I nodded, knowing the rule wasn't about light. It was about what darkness could bring. The sub moved carefully into the basin, instruments humming quietly, sonar sweeping the edges. Shadows loomed at the periphery, shapes too large or irregular to classify. I kept telling myself that we just needed to observe, to log, and then leave before the threshold passed. The pilot adjusted our depth, keeping us above the soft sediment to avoid disturbing anything. Hanley glanced at the time, calculating how long we had left, his face pale under the sublights. A faint, almost imperceptible pulse traveled through the water, like the heartbeat of the trench itself. I tried to ignore it, focusing on controls, logs, and the mundane readings that felt safer than speculation. Hanley whispered that the chamber seemed alive, responding to our presence, and I reminded him silently why Rule 11, always leave the deepest chamber before sunset, existed. Delay here could be fatal. The shadows shifted, moving as though aware of our hesitation, their forms stretching and contracting with the pulse. Minutes ticked by, stretching into eternity as we explored the basin cautiously. I noticed subtle movements in the sediment along the floor, almost too precise to be natural. The pilot asked if we should turn back, his voice tight, and I confirmed we would soon, though curiosity screamed at me to linger. Hanley's gaze was fixed on a faint glowing outline ahead, but I refused to acknowledge it. To engage was to risk being claimed by whatever rules governed this place. The glow grew brighter as we neared a series of stalactite-like formations suspended in the water, casting distorted shadows that seemed to reach for us. My pulse raced as I realized that staying even a moment longer could trap us. The sub's hull vibrated ever so slightly, a warning that I interpreted instinctively. Hanley whispered, "We shouldn't be here past whatever's coming." I nodded, gripping the console tightly. Timing mattered more than exploration. The sub began its slow retreat, reversing course towards safer, narrower sections of the trench. I kept glancing back at the basin, aware that something unseen followed us in subtle, imperceptible ways. Every instinct told me that the rule existed because nightfall, or what passed for it in these depths, was not merely a measure of light, but of danger that could manifest without warning. Hanley's breathing quickened, and I reminded myself to stay calm. Panic here was a contagion. As we moved out of the deepest chamber, the ambient glow faded, replaced by familiar darkness that still felt threatening. Instruments remained stable, yet I sensed a tension from the shadows we'd passed. The pilot's hands were steady, but I could feel the tension radiating through his posture. I repeated in my mind why Rule 11, always leave the deepest chamber before sunset, was vital. Delay could draw the attention of forces we couldn't understand. The basin slowly receded behind us, swallowed by the curvature of the trench. I kept our speed controlled, ensuring no sudden movements betrayed our passage. Hanley glanced at me, wide-eyed, finally silent, absorbing the lesson in restraint and timing. I allowed myself a brief exhale, knowing we'd followed the final rule, though the weight of what we'd seen pressed on me. The shadows didn't vanish, they lingered patient and unseen. The sub descended further along the main trench, leaving the basin and its dangers behind, but the echo of the chamber remained etched in my mind. I realized that the rules hadn't been arbitrary. Each existed because survival depended on discipline, observation, and timing. Breaking any of them could mean something far worse than injury or disorientation. Hanley finally whispered, "We made it for now." I didn't respond, knowing that our safety was temporary. As the sub drifted through the narrowing trench, deeper into the Mariana darkness, I felt a weight that was both relief and foreboding. The shadows, the echoes, the mirrored forms, the tapping, they had marked us, each rule a thread in a fragile tapestry of survival. The abyss remained patient, endless, indifferent, but it remembered. I kept my eyes forward, knowing the rules were our only lifeline, and that breaking even one would be irreversible. I logged the final chamber meticulously, noting times, positions, and anomalies, but resisted adding any interpretation. Hanley watched silently, comprehension dawning fully on his face. The pilot navigated with precision, every adjustment deliberate, and as the trench twisted ahead into near total black, I felt the weight of all 11 rules settle heavily in my mind, knowing that this was only the beginning of understanding the Mariana Trench. If you enjoyed this story, like, share, and subscribe for more.